Thank you, Jonathan. Oops. Can everybody hear me in the back okay? Excellent. Thank you for coming. I know this is a very hard day to go inside. So I appreciate you spending some of the sunshine in here. I'm going to do a combination of reading and talking and then take questions. For those who don't know what HeLa cells are, the name HeLa is spelled H-E-L-A, and it stands for Henrietta, H-E for Henrietta, and L-A for lax. So it's an abbreviation of her name. And you'll hear all about what the cells are and what they've done as I talk. So the scenes I'm going to read are condensed scenes from the book. So if it seems like I'm skipping around at all, it's because I am. And I'm just going to start at the beginning of the story, which is when Henrietta went to the hospital for the first time. On January 29th, 1951, David Lax sat behind the wheel of his old Buick watching the rain fall. He was parked under a towering oak tree outside Johns Hopkins Hospital with 3 of his children, 2 still in diapers, waiting for their mother, Henrietta. A few minutes earlier, she jumped out of the car, pulled her jacket over her head, and scurried into the hospital, past the colored bathroom, the only one she was allowed to use. In the next building, under an elegant domed copper roof, a 10.5-foot marble statue of Jesus stood, arms spread wide, holding court over what was once the main entrance of Hopkins. No one in Henrietta's family ever saw a Hopkins doctor without visiting the Jesus statue, laying flowers at his feet, saying a prayer, and rubbing his big toe for good luck. But that day, Henrietta didn't stop. She went straight to the waiting room of the gynecology clinic, a wide open space, empty, but for rows of long, straight-backed benches that looked like church pews. "I got a knot on my womb," she told the receptionist. "The doctor needs to have a look." The day before, Henrietta went to the bathroom and found blood spotting her underwear. She filled her bathtub, lowered herself into the warm water, and spread her legs. With the door closed to her children, husband, and cousins, Henrietta slid a finger inside herself and rubbed it across her cervix until she found what she somehow knew she'd find, a hard lump, deep inside, as though someone had lodged a marble just to the left of the opening to her womb. Henrietta climbed out of the bathtub, dried herself off, and dressed. Then she told her husband, "You better take me to the doctor. I'm bleeding, and it ain't my time." Hopkins was one of the top hospitals in the country. It was built in 1889 as a charity hospital for the sick and poor, and it covered more than a dozen acres where a cemetery and insane asylum once sat in East Baltimore. The public wards at Hopkins were filled with patients, most of them black and unable to pay their medical bills. David drove Henrietta nearly 20 miles to get there, not because they preferred it, but because it was the only major hospital for miles that treated black patients. This was the era of Jim Crow. When black people showed up at white-only hospitals, the staff was likely to send them away, even if it meant they might die in the parking lot. Even Hopkins, which did treat black patients, segregated them in colored wards and had colored-only fountains. So when the nurse called Henrietta from the waiting room, she led her through a single door to a colored-only exam room, one in a long row of rooms divided by clear glass walls that let nurses see from one to the next. Henrietta undressed, wrapped herself in a starched white hospital gown, and laid down on a wooden exam table, waiting for Howard Jones, the gynecologist on duty. Jones was thin and graying, his deep voice softened by a faint southern accent. When he walked into the room, Henrietta told him about the lump. Before examining her, he flipped through her chart, a quick sketch of her life and a litany of untreated conditions. 6th or 7th grade education, housewife, and mother of 5. Patient had one toothache for nearly 5 years. Only anxiety is oldest daughter, who's epileptic and can't talk. Well-nourished, cooperative. Patient was one of 10 siblings. One died of car accident, one from rheumatic heart, one was poisoned. Been with husband since age 14 and has no liking for sexual intercourse. Patient has asymptomatic neurosyphilis, but canceled syphilis treatments, said she felt fine. 2 months prior to current visit, after delivery of fifth child, patient had significant blood in urine. Tests showed areas of increased cellular activity in the cervix. Physician recommended diagnostics and referred to a specialist for ruling out infection or cancer. Patient canceled appointment. It was no surprise she hadn't come back all those times for follow-up. For Henrietta, walking into Hopkins was like entering a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She knew about harvesting tobacco and butchering a pig, but she'd never heard the words cervix or biopsy. She didn't read or write much, and she hadn't studied science in school. She, like most Black patients, only went to Hopkins when she thought she had no choice. Jones listened as Henrietta told him about the pain, the blood. She lay back on the table, feet pressed in stirrups as she stared at the ceiling, and sure enough, Jones found a lump exactly where she'd said he would. He described it as an eroded hard mass, about the size of a nickel. He'd seen easily 1,000 cervical cancer lesions, but never anything like this. Shiny and purple, like grape jello, he wrote later. And so delicate it bled at the slightest touch. Jones cut a small sample and sent it to the pathology lab down the hall for diagnosis, then told Henrietta to go home. Soon after, he dictated notes about Henrietta. Her history is interesting in that she had a term delivery here at this hospital September 19th, 1950, he said. No note is made in the history at that time or at the 6 weeks return visit that there's any visible abnormality of the cervix. Yet here she was, just 3 months later, with a full-fledged tumor. Either her doctors had missed it during her last exams, which seemed impossible, or it had grown at a terrifying rate. So Henrietta went home, and a couple days later got a phone call from Howard Jones telling her the biopsy came back as cervical cancer. And he called her back in for what was the standard treatment of the day, which was radium therapy. So they would take tubes of radioactive material and sew those to the surface of the cervix to essentially burn off the cancer. And they did this under anesthesia. And since I know there are quite a few probably researchers and some physicians in the room, I'm going to read the consent form that she signed when she got there. I hereby give consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins Hospital to perform any operative procedure and under any anesthetic, either local or general, they may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of blank. Henrietta printed her name in the blank space. A witness with illegible handwriting signed a line at the bottom, and Henrietta signed another. And so they put her under anesthetic, and before applying the radium, her doctor, without telling Henrietta, took a small piece of her tumor and put it in a dish. And he sent that dish down the hall to George Guy, who was the head of tissue culture research at Hopkins. And George Guy had been trying to grow human cells outside of the body for decades, and it had never worked. He and many other scientists were trying to create an immortal human cell, one that would grow in laboratories indefinitely. It would just essentially survive in the lab as long as you fed it and kept it warm and kept it clean. And no one had been able to do that. Cells would live for a few days maybe, and they would die. And Henrietta's just never did. No one is entirely sure why, but her cells are still alive today, still growing in laboratories around the world. And within 2 days of her leaving the hospital, they were doubling their numbers every 24 hours. So they went from 1 dish to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, and they sort of very quickly filled the lab. And George Guy started telling his colleagues, I think I've got an immortal human cell line. And they all said, great, can we have some? And he said, sure. So he would take tubes of HeLa cells, and today you can order cells through the mail and they just show up in your lab. But in the 50s, you couldn't send cells by mail. So he would take tubes to the airport and convince flight attendants and pilots to put them in their pockets and fly wherever he needed them to go. So he'd find a plane going to Minneapolis and say, here, will you take this to Minneapolis? And a scientist on the other end would meet the cells at the airport and run back to the lab and grow them and give them to his friends, who'd give them to their friends, who'd give them to their friends. And pretty quickly, Henrietta's cells started spreading all around the world. But this was not the most efficient way of distributing the cells. So pretty quickly, a factory was set up at the Tuskegee Institute where they began mass producing her cells to the tune of about 6 trillion cells a week in these huge vats of liquid, and they would send those out to laboratories. And the cells quickly became one of the most important things that happened to medicine in that era. They were used to help develop the polio vaccine. They went up in the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity. Her cells were the first ever cloned. Her genes were some of the first ever mapped. Her cells were used to create some of our most important cancer medications, like vincristine and tamoxifen. The HPV vaccine can be traced back to her cells. I mean, the list of advances just goes on and on. And the cells grew as quickly in her body as they had in the lab. So she was 30 years old when she was diagnosed, and within about 6 months, that nickel-sized tumor had spread to almost every organ in her body, and she died, leaving 5 kids behind and a husband. And they didn't know anything about the cells growing, and they just sort of went on with their lives. And for a few decades, scientists just used the cells, and they very quickly started using the same techniques that they used to grow HeLa to grow lots of other cells. So their goal was to create a library of tissues from all sorts of different people, all sorts of different tumors, so that they could study various diseases and normal cells. And so in the late 60s, one young scientist, this was the early days of gene mapping, he started looking at some of the genetic markers in some of these cells, and he was looking at a prostate cancer cell. And he noticed that it had 2 X chromosomes. And you can't have a prostate cell with 2 X chromosomes because women have 2 X chromosomes and men have an X and a Y, and women don't have prostates. So he thought, well, that's weird. And he started looking at other genetic markers in the cells, and he found that they had this very rare enzyme that's really only found in black people. And even among black people, it's very rare. And so he's like, well, that's odd, because this prostate cancer cell was supposed to be from a white guy. And so he's like, so this white guy's prostate seemed to be from a black woman. And so he started looking at all these other cells that were supposed to be from various other people, and sure enough, they all had 2 X chromosomes, and they all had this very rare marker for this enzyme only found in black people. So he pretty quickly figured out that Henrietta's cells had essentially taken over all of these other cultures. And without knowing it, scientists had been growing and regrowing HeLa cells, thinking they were growing lots of other things. And this happened because cells can float on dust particles in the air. If you touch a dish with cells in them and then you go and touch another dish, you can transfer cells from one to the other on your hands. If you pipette them with a little device, you move cells from one place to the other and then reuse that pipette. You can transfer cells. And HeLa cells are so powerful and sort of so hardy that they just outgrow any other cells in a dish. So one HeLa cell landing in a dish can just take over, and you can't tell when you look with the naked eye at a dish what kind of cell is growing. So this started a very large controversy. A lot of scientists denied that this had ever happened. It called into question a lot of their research results, because if you were doing a study on how a certain drug affected prostate cancer cells, and it turned out you were using cervical cancer cells, it didn't really tell you that much about prostate cancer. So to settle this debate, one scientist at Hopkins decided to track down Henrietta's kids. And he figured he would treat this like a crime scene. And if he could get DNA from her children, that he could compare their DNA with all these cells, and if they were all HeLa cells, their DNA would match her kids. So Henrietta's husband got a phone call one day. At this point, this is the early 70s, and he had a 3rd grade education. He didn't know what a cell was. And the way he understood this phone call was, we've got your wife, she's alive in a laboratory. We've been doing research on her for the last 25 years, and now we have to test your children to see if they have the cancer that killed their mother. None of which was what the scientists said at all. The scientists said, we need to look at your children's HLA markers and compare those to the HeLa cells. And Her husband thought they had her in a cell, like a prison cell. That was the only kind of cell he'd ever heard of. And so her family got sucked into this world of research that they didn't really understand, and the scientists didn't understand that the family didn't understand. And this went on for a few decades. The scientists would come to the house and take samples and leave, and the children would wait for their test results, which would never come. They would call the switchboard at Hopkins and say, "We're calling for our test results," and the operator would say, "I'm sorry, we have no record of you as patients. We don't have any tests for you." And pretty soon, her kids figured out that they didn't have Henrietta alive somewhere. They couldn't go visit her in the way she'd been before she died. But for them, it was very unclear what it meant to have part of her alive in these laboratories, and this was particularly true for her daughter, Deborah, who was a very religious woman. She very much believed her mother's soul was alive in these cells, and the scientists would come to the house, and she would say things like, "Can my mother rest in peace if you're shooting these bits of her up to the moon, and if you're injecting them with these chemicals, does that somehow hurt her? And when you infect them with polio and these other viruses, does she get sick wherever she is?" And she was 2 when her mother died. She didn't know anything about her, and she really hoped that these cells could tell her something about her mother. So she would also ask the scientists, "Can you look at these cells and tell me what my mother's favorite color was, and whether she liked to dance, and if she breastfed me?" And the scientists had no idea how to respond to her, and one of them gave her a medical school genetics textbook and said, "Here, read this. This will tell you what you need to know about the cells." And Henrietta's kids were all deaf and hard of hearing, and no one realized this until they were adults. So they had gone through their whole schooling without really being able to hear anything. So they didn't really learn how to read or write, and they weren't people who sort of asked questions of people in authority, so they just sort of went along with this and didn't ask any questions. And eventually her sons figured out that in addition to all the science that had been done on the cells, they had also been commercialized. So Henrietta's cells, today we have a sort of multi-billion-dollar industry based on buying and selling tissues and cells and patenting genes, and it really all started with HeLa cells. They were the first ones ever bought and sold, and when the family found out about this, they were pretty angry. To this day, they can't afford health insurance, and they often say, if our mother's cells were so important to medicine, why can't we go to the doctor? And if people are buying and selling these things, essentially, where's our cut? And no one could ever answer that question for them. So then I came along in the late 90s, and still nobody had explained to them what a cell was, but they were very much done with people who came along wanting things having to do with the cells, which I essentially was. I was one in a long line of those people. And I'm just going to read quickly the first time I called Henrietta's husband. And this was, I had gotten her daughter Deborah on the phone very briefly, and she was very excited about the idea of a book about her mother. She said, "Oh, that would be great, and maybe I could learn about her and what happened to these cells." But then she sort of panicked and said that she thought maybe Hopkins had sent me to steal her cells so that they could do more research on her. And she hung up on me. And so this next call was the first time I talked to Deborah's father. And the only thing you need to know about this is his name is, they call him Day, D-A-Y, it's his nickname. So finally, after several days of leaving messages, someone answered at Day's house. A young boy who didn't say hello, just breathed into the receiver, hip-hop thumping in the background. When I asked for David, the boy said, "Yeah," then threw down the phone. "Go get Pop," he yelled, followed by a long pause. "It's important. Get Pop." No response. The boy breathed into the receiver again as a second boy picked up an extension and said hello. "Who's this?" he asked. "Rebecca," I said. He moved the phone away from his mouth and yelled, "Get Pop. Some lady's on the phone about his wife's cells." Years later, I'd understand how a young boy could know why I was calling just from the sound of my voice. The only time white people called Day was when they wanted something having to do with HeLa cells. But at the time I was confused. I figured I must have heard wrong. A woman picked up a receiver, saying, "Hello, may I help you?" She was sharp, curt, like I do not have time for this. I told her I was hoping to talk to David, and she asked who I was. "Rebecca," I said, afraid she'd hang up if I said anything more. "Just a moment." She sighed and lowered the phone. "Go take this today," she told the child. "Tell him he's got a long-distance call. Somebody named Rebecca calling about his wife's cells." The child grabbed the phone, pressed it to his ear, and ran for day. There was a long silence. "Pop, get up," the kid whispered. "There's somebody about your wife." "What?" "Get up. There's somebody about your wife's cells." "What? Where?" "Wife's cells on the phone. Get up." "Where her cells?" "Here," the boy said, handing Day the phone. "Yeah?" "Hi, is this David Lax?" "Yeah." I told him my name and started to explain why I was calling, but before I could say much, he let out a deep sigh. "Oh, it's this," he mumbled in a deep Southern accent, his words slurred like he'd had a stroke. "You got my wife's cells?" "Yeah," I said, thinking he was asking if I was calling about his wife's cells. "Yeah?" he said, suddenly alert. "You got my wife's cells? She know you're calling?" "Yeah," I said, thinking he was asking if Deborah knew I was calling. "Well, so let my old lady's cells talk to you and leave me alone," he snapped. "I had enough of you people." Then he hung up. So it took about a year and a half to convince the family to talk to me after that. But eventually they did, and part of how I won their trust was by essentially sharing information with them, particularly Deborah. She really wanted to know about her mother, and so I would gather information and send it to her in the mail and leave stories on her answering machine as I'd find them, because she'd never answer the phone because she had caller ID. And eventually she sort of said, she said, "Okay, I'll talk to you, you just can't, you have to promise you'll never hide anything from me." And I said, "Hey, I have no intention of hiding anything from you. You can come with me when I do my research." And she did. So the book, it traces the story of the HeLa cells, and you can trace a lot of modern medicine and bioethics through the story of the cells. It also tells the story of Henrietta and her family, but then really becomes the story of Deborah traveling around, going into research laboratories and various places, trying to come to terms with these cells and sort of what they meant for her family and to kind of move on. So I'm going to read one more short scene and then take questions. And this is the first place that Deborah and I went together, was into a laboratory so she could see the cells for the first time. So she's in her mid-50s at this point. And the scientist whose lab we're in, his name's Christoph. And the other person there with us is named Zakaria, and that's Henrietta's youngest son, so Deborah's brother. Christoph walked toward us through the lobby of his building, smiling, hand outstretched. He was in his mid-30s with perfectly worn denim jeans, a blue plaid shirt, and shaggy light brown hair. He shook my hand in Deborah's, then reached for Zakaria's, but Zakaria didn't move. "Okay," Christoph said, looking at Deborah. "It must be pretty hard for you to come into a lab at Hopkins after what you've been through. I'm really glad to see you here." Christoph threw open the door to his lab with a sweeping ta-da motion and waved us inside. "This is where we keep all the cells," he yelled, over a deafening mechanical hum that made Deborah's and Zakaria's hearing aids squeal. Zakaria's hand shot up and tore his from his ear. Deborah adjusted the volume on hers, then walked past Christoph into a room filled wall to wall with white freezers, stacked one on top of the other, rumbling like a sea of washing machines in an industrial laundromat. She shot me a wide-eyed, terrified look. Christoph pulled the handle of a white floor-to-ceiling freezer, and it opened with a hiss, releasing a cloud of steam into the room. Deborah screamed and jumped behind Zakaria, who stood expressionless, hands in his pockets. "Don't worry," Christoph yelled. "It's not dangerous, it's just cold. They're not minus 20 Celsius like your freezers at home. They're minus 80. That's why when I open them, smoke comes out." He motioned for Deborah to come closer. "It's all full of her cells," he said. Deborah loosened her grip on Zakaria and inched forward until the icy breeze hit her face, and she stood staring at thousands of inch-tall plastic vials filled with red liquid. "Oh, God," she gasped. "I can't believe all that's my mother." Christoph reached into the freezer, took out a vial, and pointed to the letters HELA written on its side. "There are millions and millions of her cells in there," he said. "Maybe billions. You can keep them here forever, 50 years, 100 years, even more. Then you just thaw them out and they grow." He rocked the vial of HeLa cells back and forth in his hand as he started talking about how careful you have to be when you handle them. "We have an extra room just for the cells," he said. "That's important, because you don't want HeLa cells to contaminate other cultures in a lab." He explained how the HeLa contamination problem happened, then said, "Her cells cause millions of dollars in damage." Seems like a bit of poetic justice, doesn't it? "Oh, my mother was just getting back at scientists for keeping all them secrets from the family," Deborah said. "You don't mess with Henrietta. She'll sick HeLa on your ass." Christoph reached into the freezer behind him, grabbed another vial of HeLa cells, and held it out to Deborah, his eyes soft. She stood stunned for a moment, staring into his outstretched hand, then grabbed the vial and began rubbing it fast between her palms, like she was warming herself in winter. "She's cold," Deborah said, cupping her hands and blowing onto the vial. Christoph motioned for us to follow him to the incubator where he warmed the cells, but Deborah didn't move. As Zakari and Christoph walked away, she raised the vial and touched it to her lips. "You're famous," she whispered. "Just nobody knows it." Okay, I'm going to stop there and take questions. Thanks. Questions? And before we start with the questions, I want to say occasionally people have questions about things that happen in the last chapter of the book. And if you can ask me those privately, I would appreciate it. Because often people give away the end of the book in Q&As. So now I ask people not to do that. So yeah, any questions? So the question is essentially what would happen today differently in terms of consent, and that she said one of the most troubling things about the story is that there was no consent at the time. And you're right, at the time it was standard practice to do things like this without consent. This was something people were doing, worldwide. We didn't even have the concept of informed consent that we have now. And so what would happen today depends on a few different things. What happened with her kids when scientists went to them and took tissues just for research and didn't get informed consent, that would be illegal today. So there's a federal law that says a scientist can't come to you and take samples just for research without telling you what they're doing. But there's a couple caveat there. Where it gets a little trickier is with tissues taken for other things. So routine biopsies, when any child is born in the United States, it's the law that you have to get fetal blood samples and test for genetic diseases, which is a good thing. And those samples are often stored. And people don't realize that samples taken for medical testing and various things are often stored for research. And so you go into a hospital, you sign a form that says you can dispose of my tissues any way you see fit, you can use them in research. That's what this means. They go into these big biobanks where they're often used in research, and if your identity is stripped from them, which it is, if someone can't do research on your samples with your identity on them without your consent. But if your identity is stripped from them and a researcher hasn't had firsthand contact with you, and instead just gets the samples from a biobank, that doesn't require informed consent. So in fact, a lot of the research done on tissues in the US at this point doesn't require any sort of consent from people in an informed way. It also doesn't require any disclosure of potential financial gains that something might be turned into a commercial product. And what's interesting is how different institutions deal with that. It varies really widely. So you may go to one a university hospital somewhere, and they have just an institutional policy of consent. So some places you'll go and they'll give you a book that says, this is what tissue research is, this is a picture of our tissue bank, this is what we do, and they give you all sorts of information and ask your permission to store your tissues. They don't have to do that. That's something that places decide on an institution by institution basis. So in that way, it depends on where you go. And this is something that's being debated a lot right now. There are quite a few sort of legal cases that have come up related to this, and so it's something that's being debated sort of nationwide, sort of how to move forward.
So has Deborah's religious view on the cell changed after all these discoveries?
That's a good question. The question was, has Deborah's sort of religious, spiritual view of the cells changed with her and sort of understanding of the science? And it didn't at all. In fact, the whole family, their religious beliefs and their faith, in a lot of ways, was what helped them come to terms with all of this and to see the cells as a positive thing. So they very much believed that Henrietta was brought back to life as an angel in these cells, and that the cells are her brought back to life to help people, and occasionally cause problems if you make her mad, but for the most part, here to do good. And for them, that was something that let them sort of move on from some of the anger associated with the cells. So now they look at the cells and they think that they're a miracle. They're sort of a wonderful thing that's happened. They don't like the way it happened, so they're still pretty angry about that. But the faith portion of the way they see the cells has actually been really helpful for them. And the truth is, there is no concrete answer for why her cells grew and other cells didn't. She had HPV, which, the virus that causes cervical cancer. Her cells have multiple copies of the HPV genome in them. So some scientists have said, well, maybe there's something about that she has a lot of the genome. And she also had syphilis, which can weaken your immune system and cause cancer to grow more aggressively. So did a lot of people in the 50s, and their cells didn't grow. So there are a few things we know about her cells, but why hers grew when none others didn't, there is still not like a concrete answer for that. And so, for her family, they just sort of think it's funny that people are still looking for an answer for that. Because for them, they're like, it says right here in the Bible, believers will be brought back to life and they will be granted immortality. And so they think that that's the explanation for it.
Thanks for the talk. Jonathan mentioned that you found this story compelling first in some way when you were 16. Could you talk a little bit about what compelled you to tell the story and what made you hold on to it? And then also, if your motivation or your approach as a writer shifted at all once you came into such close contact with the family?
Yeah, so the question is about what drew me to the story, what made me keep going, and did my sort of relationship with the story and approach change as I got closer to the family? And yeah, I learned about the cells for the first time when I was 16. I was in a basic biology class in a community college, one of these huge lecture hall classes, which I know you guys have here, which Jonathan teaches often. And my teacher mentioned the cells as most biology teachers do at some point, and he said, these were the first immortal cells grown in culture, and they were so important for science. And what's interesting and was unusual, though I didn't know it at the time, was he knew her name. So he wrote Henrietta Lacks in big letters on the board and said she was a black woman. And then that was it, and class was over, and he erased her name and sort of moved on. And I went up to him after class, and I was like, well, what else do we know about her, and who was she, and why do we just know those two things? And he just said, that's it, that's all we know, and sorry. And he said, if you're curious, go see if you can find anything and write a little paper, I'll give you some extra credit. And and I didn't write an extra credit paper at the time. I did when the book finally came out. I got the pre-publication copies of it. I tracked him down. He's long retired. And this was like, right? You're in one of those huge auditorium classes. You don't even know who half your students are. And so I tracked him down, 25 years later, and I sent him a note that said, "Dear Mr. Deffler, here's my extra credit paper." It's about 25 years late, but I had a really good excuse. And the story of me in his classroom is in the prologue of the book, and so I think he was a little surprised to find himself in the book. But, it was just, it stuck. And I think there are a couple reasons for that. When I was 16, my father had been, he had gotten a viral encephalitis that caused pretty severe brain damage. And he had gone from being this sort of marathon running dad, super dad kind of guy, to not being able to move, really. He couldn't walk. He was bedridden sort of in our living room, and he couldn't drive. He lost his memory. And he enrolled in a drug study at the local university hospital, and one of my jobs as a teenager was drive dad to the hospital 4 times a week for these infusions of, a drug or a placebo, we didn't know. And I would sit, the place where they did this was a sort of big solarium, and any research studies that were going on having to do with drugs were done in this room, so patients from all sorts of different studies would just sit in this huge room getting infusions, and I would hang out and do my homework there. And so I think this all happened at a time where I was ripe to notice something like this. So, I had spent all this time dealing with the emotions of watching my dad as being involved in research, and the sort of hope that comes with that maybe it was going to fix him, but then it didn't, and the anger that came with that, and this, fear. And so I think when I heard this, my first question was, did she have any kids, and what did they think about all this? And I think it's because I was a kid going through watching my own parent be used in research in some way. So I think it was just sort of the timing of it that probably is what made it really stick. But I had no intention of being a writer. I was going to be a veterinarian. So I didn't start writing until I was a junior in college. But I just did the story had always stuck in the back of my head. And really one of the first things I wrote was just sort of a piece imagining something about her, since I didn't know anything. So it's just sort of been there forever. And in terms of my relationship to the story and how that changed, I didn't know anything about what happened to the family. So for me, it was about her and these cells until I first talked to Deborah. And I heard the fear in her voice when she thought that I had been sent to steal the cells from her. And the little bits that I heard from her just made it clear that something much bigger had happened that I didn't know about. And that just made me want to know even more. So that kind of was a lot of what motivated me to keep going, I think. People?
You can.
Are these the only cells that have lived all this time, or just this one person, this one family of cells, and no other?
Well, there have been other cells since, and scientists can now immortalize a cell, so they can take cells from anybody and change them with a virus and turn them into an immortal cell now. Hers were the first, and so none have been around as long as hers. And some grew after hers, but the sort of, hers are still very unusual. They grow with this, they are very hardy, and they're sort of tough cells. They're often used in teaching because you can sort of screw up with HeLa cells quite a bit before you kill them, which isn't the case with a lot of other cells. A lot of cells are more fragile than hers. And they grow in this very uniform way. So there's a lot about them that's sort of unusual, but no, there are others since.
The other thing that's intriguing about this story is you're talking about a time in the country when white people wouldn't even drink out of the same fountain as a black person. And here they were experimenting with these genes, and you said, putting them in white males, or they found them in white male prostate, right?
Well, so they were actually her cells. They just thought they were someone else's cells. So it wasn't that they were in other people. But yeah, so the point, what he said was that one of the things that I guess gets you about it is that this was happening at a time when white people wouldn't drink out of a water fountain that a black person was drinking out of, but yet there was all this research being done on her cells. And the story of the polio vaccine to me is amazing for that reason. 1953, 54 was the height of the polio epidemic. The number of people who were dying every year was the worst in the epidemic's history, and people were desperate for a vaccine. The vaccine was developed but couldn't be given out to people until it was tested, and they needed cells that would grow on a very large scale for not very much money that they could test the polio vaccine on, and hers came along at exactly the right time. And so this factory that was set up to mass produce her cells, this was at the Tuskegee Institute, which is an all-black institution. So black scientists in a black university use cells from a black woman to make it possible for everyone to get the polio vaccine, and no one knew that. So it went out and helped, millions of white people in the 50s at a time when, it would have been very interesting to hear their responses if they'd known that this vaccine that they were getting was made possible by testing done by black people on a black woman's cells. I mean, the irony of that. And that all of that was happening at the Tuskegee Institute down the hall from where one of the most unethical, sort of historic studies was being done at the same time. So the Tuskegee syphilis studies, where they were studying, black men with syphilis without essentially treating them, was happening at the same time. So it's a very complicated irony. Yeah.
Rebecca, first I want to make a comment about informed consent. It seems that, if you read in the New York Times yesterday, that informed consent is still a work in progress.
Yes.
And that, for people who didn't see that article in the New York Times, it was a story.
Yeah, I can explain it. Since I have the mic, I can explain it after the question. So what's your question?
The question was, in 1950, when Henrietta Lacks went into the hospital and they gave her a form to sign. Obviously, she didn't understand it. But what's interesting is that informed consent, really, at that time, was not as detailed or as required as it is now. But to perform an autopsy, there was a detailed kind of consent that was required. Is that kind of consent, as well as taking samples from a living person, still in effect now?
Yeah, so there was a sort of comment about the fact that informed consent is still a work in progress today. And so there's a question, in the 50s, there was not informed consent required for research on human cells and tissues, or even actual living human beings. So yeah, it was a very different time in terms of that, but there was very detailed consent required for doing autopsies at that time. So the irony was that they couldn't take cells from Henrietta's body after she had died because there was no consent, but they could before she died. And that is, yeah, it is still required a lot of consent to do autopsies, and those laws were in effect from very early on because of body snatching that had been happening. People were digging up, this is, very early days of doing, anatomy studies and stuff. There were people digging up graves and selling bodies. So some of those laws about what you could do with a cadaver came as a way to stop that body snatching. But the comment about consent being a work in progress today, she referred to this article in the New York Times yesterday. So what's interesting, I did it in an afterwards in the back of the book. It sort of goes into what the current state of things are with consent and the ethical issues raised. And in it, I talk about several different lawsuits that were pending when the book went to press, and 3 of them have been ruled on in the last couple months. So there's been a lot of sort of interesting change. And the one that was just ruled on yesterday, was this case of the Havasupai Indian tribe in Arizona, where they had donated samples to some researchers at the university in Arizona for diabetes research because they have this congenital diabetes, and they wanted, this researcher said, this could help your tribe in the future. But then the samples were later used for research looking into schizophrenia and alcoholism and various things that the tribe found stigmatizing and said they wouldn't have given permission for. And the consent form that they had signed said that they were giving these samples for, general, it was sort of medical and behavioral research. It was very, very vague consent forms. And the courts, or the case settled yesterday and in favor of the tribe. They got to take their samples back, which this case has been in litigation forever. This has been going on since the late 80s was when the research started. And they were awarded, I think it was like $700,000, and the university hospital is having to give them access to medical care, and they're giving them scholarship money so that people from the tribe can go to school. So it was a pretty big settlement, and really the first time in history that there have been many lawsuits about people who felt their tissues were used in a way that they hadn't given permission for. And this is the first one that's ever gone in favor of the people who the tissues came from. So it's a pretty big precedent, potentially. And a lot of what is being discussed about the case is the fact that this was not informed consent. This was consent. They said, yes, you can take our tissues for research, but what they thought they were giving their tissues for was different from what had happened. And so I think that, combined with a couple other similar cases that have all of them, interestingly, ruled in the favor, sort of in the same direction in the last few weeks. I think will probably change quite a bit about the way that consent is handled in the future with tissue research, and that it's going to probably require more detailed consent in the future.
Did you have more information on Henrietta's oldest daughter?
Yeah, so the question was, do I have any more information on Henrietta's oldest daughter? And this is something that comes up in questions often. There's a chapter in the book that's really about her oldest daughter, Elsie, when Elsie's the one in the little snippet of medical records that I read, that she was born epileptic and deaf. And when Henrietta got sick, she was institutionalized in a place that had been called the Home for Crazy Negroes. And it was a mental institution in the South in the 50s, and being a black person in the South in the 50s was not an easy thing. Being a black child in a mental institution for black patients in the 50s was, I can't imagine much worse. So she died in that institution when she was 15. It was a pretty brutal place. And Deborah didn't know her sister, but she just always had this feeling that something awful had happened to her, and she really wanted to know what it was. So one of the things that we do in the book is we go to this hospital, which was still standing at the time, and we find out what happened to her sister. And it turns out she was used in research without the family's knowledge that was much more, it had nothing to do with the HeLa cells. It was much more brutal than anything the family had encountered. It was research on epileptic brains. And it really is, people often say, what was the most shocking thing that happened while you were working on the book? And that, going to that hospital and finding the story of her sister, of Deborah's sister, was definitely that thing. It was really shocking, and there's not much more. I mean, what I know is in the book. I have boxes of material I just sort of couldn't stop collecting it while I was doing the research on her. I found lots of other materials about other similar hospitals that were in the area, and just being mental institutions in the 50s were not nice places, and I kind of couldn't stop collecting all this material while I was doing it. It couldn't all fit in the book, but it wasn't related to Elsie. So I imagine someday I might write about those separately, but we'll see.
This is a fascinating talk, and I haven't read your book yet. I'm looking forward to it. And my question is more about your decisions in crafting the book, how you decided to do it as creative nonfiction, and just how you kind of settled on the through lines that I imagine were in the book.
Yeah, so the question was sort of about decisions I made in terms of putting the book together. And you mentioned the decision to make it creative nonfiction, and to me, that was never a decision. I mean, and for people who don't, the term creative nonfiction often confuses people. And so generally, creative nonfiction is it's nonfiction writing that reads like fiction, but it's all true. So people often hear creative nonfiction and think, oh, well, does that mean you get to be creative with some of the facts? No, that's not the case. And for me, that's what I do. I am I think of myself as a creative science writer, and the difference is, it's not just sort of daily journalism kind of stuff, and because I think storytelling is really important in terms of making science accessible to the general public and giving people a way to care about the science. I mean, really, it's a story about a family, it's a story about, the scientists, and so I think that's all very important, and to sort of put the science in context. So for me, it was no decision. I had to do it this way. And the book is structured. There's 3 separate narratives that take place in different time periods, and it jumps back and forth in time. So the 3 are sort of braided together, and that was a long, complicated process that involved a lot of index cards on big walls, and I read a lot of. There was one point where I realized I wanted the stories to be juxtaposed against each other, because I knew that if you started at the beginning of the story and then read all the way through, it would be sort of odd. You would read for a while, and then all of a sudden, like the final third of the book, suddenly this Deborah person would take over, and I would appear, and and it was just, and that I felt like it was important to tell the family story alongside the cells and the scientists, because when you read all 3 stories together, they each take on a different weight when you see the impact that they're all having on each other. Because I wanted readers to see the importance of the science that was happening at the same time, so it wasn't just, oh, this poor victimized family, and so it's sort of such a complicated story. And then once I realized I needed to tell it that way, I got every novel I could find that was structured in a disjointed way with multiple time periods and read them all. And went to a local bookstore and I just said, please find me every book you can find like this. And oddly, fried green tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe was really useful. And then I watched a lot of movies that had similar structures. The movie Hurricane, about Hurricane Carter with Denzel Washington, is the structure of my book. Like if you watch it, it's just almost exactly what my book is. And so I would sort of steal things from other places. Yeah, it's part of why it took 11 years to write.
I have a question about the cells themselves.
Okay.
So anybody that's worked with the cells and looked at the karyotypes, I mean, you almost question whether or not they're still human.
Yeah.
And when, do scientists have any idea of what they actually might have looked like in 1950 when they were first isolated?
That's a good question. Not karyotype-wise. Yeah, no. So he said that scientists working with the cells in the laboratory, when you look at them, often it's sort of like, are they even human? I mean, they have mutated to the point when they grow in culture that there's a lot about them that's very abnormal. And, in cells growing in different laboratories, they grow in different ways. So you'll have one cell that sort of mutated in this direction, and then another cell that changed out in this direction in somebody else's lab. And there are now so many different lines of HeLa cells that all sort of behave differently that it was in I guess it was the early 90s, a group of scientists proposed that they were actually no longer human and that they should be classified as a species. They came up with a name, it was like HeLa gartellerion or something, I can't remember how to say it. But, and the theory was that, they behave more like a single-celled organism than they do like human cells, that they all came from this one cell and have become this whole species that's so different from the original. But yeah, what the original looked like is, George Guy actually gave them all away. It was funny, the American Type Culture Collection, which is this nonprofit tissue bank where they store samples of any cells that are growing, when they first started up, they went back and tried to get the original samples of as many cell lines as they could. And they went to George Guy and said, okay, we need some of the original HeLa, and he was like, oops, I gave it all away. And so he eventually found what they thought was probably still some of the first samples in one of his colleagues' labs, but they didn't ever really know for sure.
Thank you for writing this book. I've always been curious about these cells, so interested in your work. I wanted to ask you about writing in the first person, science writing in the first person. Did you find that difficult? Is that going to be a new trend in science writing? We're all going to be inserting ourselves into the story here.
So I assume that since you're in the back of the room and I heard you, probably everybody else heard too. But yeah, so the question was about the writing in the first person and was it hard and is this going to be a trend that everyone's going to do this? I was actually it was very hard for me to do, and I was really resistant to being in the story at all. I had no intention of writing any of it in the first person. And there are these three narratives, and just one of them is in the first person, so the other two are all entirely third person. And there came a point where I realized I sort of had no choice but to put myself in. And I teach writing, and I often harp on my students and say, stop inserting yourself into other people's stories, because it's not that it's a new trend. I mean, it's been happening for a long time. And partially, a lot of young writers do it because it's easier to just be like, I saw this and I saw that, rather than actually taking yourself out and writing what you saw. So I actually have an aversion to the first-person journalism. But what I realized at a certain point was that it wasn't that I was inserting myself into the sort of story, but that I had actually become a character in their story. Because I was, one in a long line of people who'd come to them wanting something, and that I had a pretty direct effect on their lives. I mean, particularly Deborah, I took her into these laboratories and into this mental institution where she ended up learning things that were pretty difficult for her, and it had some pretty negative effects on her at times. In the end, I think it was good, and I couldn't have stopped her at that point if I had tried. But she at one point almost had a stroke while we were out doing some of this because of the stress of it. And so I felt like it would be dishonest to leave myself out, and that's really where when I talk to students about it, that's where I always talk about drawing the line. Like, yes, if you belong in the story because you have an actual role in the narrative and you're a character in the story, then yeah, you should be in there. But if you're just there as a sort of observer who's just sort of, I saw this and I saw that, don't do it. But yeah, there is, a lot of this sort of journalism happens in the first person. But yeah, for me, it wasn't an easy decision. Yeah, you had your hand?
Yes. I read the book and I enjoyed it, but I have mixed emotions because many black people, not necessarily myself, African Americans, are very reluctant to participate in medical research. And this book may want them not to participate even more. And I don't know if you've thought about that.
Yeah.
But I certainly have.
Yeah, so she said that she had sort of mixed emotions about the book because there is a problem with African Americans not participating in research, and that there's this concern that telling this story will essentially make that worse and make people not want to participate even more. And that's something I thought about a lot while I was working on the book, and I tried to address that in the afterward. And one of the things that I said in that, and I say in a lot of the interviews that I do, was that the moral of this story isn't tissue research is bad and we should be scared of this and we shouldn't go to the doctor, but that the research, this is one of the reasons why I sort of told the story of the science behind it and everything, that the research is really important, but that people want to know what's going on. And that talking about these stories is how we move forward and things like this. So and this is part of why I'm out doing this book tour too, is going around and talking to groups about that, of sort of like, okay, so this did happen, how do we move forward and do it in a way that doesn't sort of make this fear and this divide worse, but sort of uses this to have a conversation.
There's so much racism.
It's true. It's true, absolutely. And there's a reason, there's a reason why there's so much fear. There's a long history of African Americans being used in research. And the thing is, this story was not a secret. This story has long been held up as, a story of this racist white scientist who knew this woman's cells were valuable and took them from her, maybe didn't treat her cancer, maybe gave her cancer in the first place so that the cells would grow. And that story has been told over and over again, and in various magazines and places, and just oral history has been sort of passed along, and none of that's true. And so part of what I wanted to do was tell both sides of the story and say, like, this is what happened, this isn't what didn't happen. And I tried very hard to have it be balanced and to sort of show the story of the scientists and their intentions, and as a conversation piece. I think it's not the kind of thing where, so then you don't tell this part of history because of the concern about the issues it'll raise. No, you tell it and then you talk about it openly, and hopefully it'll have an effect of people talking about it more and being more open about some of this stuff. And across the board, I mean, I've talked to in community centers in predominantly black neighborhoods, and and the response, I mean, people do want to talk about it, and there is this, I don't think it's actually going to make things worse. I do think that there is a way in which the conversation is sort of moving forward and saying, okay, well, this is out there, and I think a lot of people are waiting to hear how Hopkins responds to things, and I think in some ways the story's not done yet, and that will have an effect on this as well. Hopkins is actually, it's really interesting. The week the book came out, they issued a statement that said, yes, we took the cells without permission. That was standard procedure for the day. We gave the cells away for free. We didn't make any money. And then that was it. They didn't say anything about the research on the family, or her medical records were released and published at a certain point. I mean, there are various other things that happened. And I really think they hadn't read the book yet. And I went to Hopkins a few weeks later, and I showed up. I was speaking in a writing class, and I showed up for this writing class, and there was a line of people from Hopkins waiting to talk to me. I was like, hello, I'm the head of the Hopkins IRB. Hello, I'm the head of the tissue center. And their response was, we're not okay with the statement that the school put out, and we think this needs to be really taken more seriously. And so now there's this huge effort going on at Hopkins where they're going to have a very big response to the family and to the various things, and I think that will probably help as well. So in some ways, I think the public discussion is going to, I hope, help to sort of move things forward.
So there's someone been waiting in the back for her. Yeah.
So before the book was published, was there any type of official response from Hopkins to the family? Had any of the physicians apologized, or
No.
any type of discussions with any of the members of the family?
No, yeah, there had been no response from Hopkins, and I mean, there still hasn't, but it's going to come. But no, there'd been no response from Hopkins or anybody. Yeah, so there's been no official response to the family. And this was something that I thought about a lot as a sort of writer coming to this was that there has been this long history of people benefiting in some way or another off the story and not doing anything for the family, and I didn't want to do that. And so I set up a foundation. It's called the Henrietta Lacks Foundation. It's online, henriettalacksfoundation.org, and some of the proceeds of the book go in there, and it's a scholarship fund for the descendants of Henrietta Lacks, so they can go to school, and hopefully it will help her kids with health care. And anyone can donate to it, and they have been. So individual scientists have been donating pretty steadily. Just someone who reads the book and says, I want to do something for the family. A lot of people from the general public, almost every day, there's at least one, if not more, donations, and they range from $1 to a few $100s. And there's been no sort of big donation yet from, I imagine that I kind of hope that at some point there will be, institutions that feel comfortable donating to the foundation where they might not feel comfortable writing a check to the family. But that hasn't happened yet, but the book's only been out about 2 months, so we'll see.
Maybe just one or two more.
So you just mentioned a couple minutes ago about the book tour, and in your interview, I think it was in February with Bob Edwards, you talked about your decision to do the book tour, that was really important to you. And so can you talk a little bit more about that? Because it did sound like that was kind of an exceptional thing to do the book tour, and so if you could talk more about that decision and why the tour was important.
Yeah, so the question was to talk about why I decided to do this book tour, and that and it is in some way, I guess, part of what was exceptional about it was more the scope of the tour, that I left my house on January 29th and I'm not going home till June. So that's unusual. And that's just sort of me. I'm sort of extreme in that way, I guess. But what was unusual really was that my publishing house said that they said we don't do book tours anymore. Really, this is a trend in publishing, is that authors don't go on tour anymore unless you're a sort of known quantity going out there and you're best-selling author and they know people are going to come and hear you. And even in that case, they often won't because they feel like the cost of sending an author around doesn't add up doesn't pay off in the end. And so I had always just sort of assumed I was going to go on a book tour, and I wanted to, and then I heard that they didn't do that anymore, and I was like, what do you mean I can't go on a book tour? And so I contacted a lot of friends and reached out to people like Jonathan on Twitter and Facebook and said, hey, I'm putting together this book tour myself, and you want to have me come and give a talk? And so I put together the tour, basically going from university to university talking, and then once I was sort of in a region, then I would set up book events at libraries and community centers and bookstores, and so that was part of what, if Bob Edwards, the interview we were talking about it being unusual, it was sort of that I did it myself even after they said don't do it. And the line was people don't come out and hear writers talk, especially not about science. And so it's been gratifying that, I've been like standing room only at a lot of places, and I keep taking pictures of audiences and sending them back. But, and for me, the decision to go on the book tour, a lot of it was this desire to go out and talk to people and answer questions, and to sort of head off what I knew was going to be some pretty, just a lot of fear in response to the story. I mean, I wanted to be out there answering questions and saying, sort of, this is not a reason to not go to the doctor, and let's talk about that. And just to have it, I feel like the book is in a lot of ways about the importance of communicating science to the general public. And so I just felt like it was sort of part of the work of the book to go out and talk to people about it. So it was some of that, and I think there's a little bit of closure for me as well. You work on a book for 11 years, like go out and talk to people about it, and then okay, maybe I'll be able to move on at some point, but.
One more, and then
Okay.
we'll have
no.
book signing and sales afterwards, so you can pester her a little bit.
Thank you for allowing us. I just wanted to congratulate you on your book. I'm actually a scientist, and for me, the way that you wove in the human aspects of it were really enlightening for me. And I didn't really have appreciation for the historical impact of these types of studies on the African American community. I actually do research in HIV area, and for a long time I couldn't understand the resistance of the African American communities to much of the developments in that area. And this book just opened that up to me. Now I can completely understand it. So I think addressing your question, I think it might have the opposite effect on on the community that we can actually talk about these things and get them out in the open. And I think the timing is perfect, especially with the new types of things with stem cells that are coming on.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
That's when the doctors and health.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, but I think you're right, it does.
Yeah.
It depends upon everybody getting engaged in the process.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I hear that all the time from scientists. I get emails almost every day, if not more often, from scientists saying basically that is this sort of, there is this, often, and HIV is certainly an area where this happens, that there's almost this, scientists often think, well, there's this kind of conspiracy theory thing, like how could they possibly think that we might be injecting them with something? And a lot of it is just not knowing the history and not knowing that well, because, things like that have actually happened. And so but I do hear from scientists all the time saying that and saying essentially, thank you, this gives us a sort of case study to use and look at the ways and the places that the communication broke down, the places that scientists should have done one thing when they did another. And, so I do think and I hope that it will actually help with sort of bridging the communication gap that feeds a lot of the mistrust that's out there. So yeah, I agree. Thank you. And I'll be signing books and answering more questions.
Thank Rebecca again.
Thank you. That's okay.
And there will be a book sale and signing over here for a little